Perhaps texts would even shed their singular categorical identities. In the beginning of this lecture, I also told you that new historicists wanted to erase the boundaries between history and literature. Here it is. Perhaps texts would even shed their singular categorical identities, their division into literary and historical. At the very least, history could be imagined up as a part of their contingency, a component of their time-bound materiality, an element of their predictability. Greenblatt insists that history could at the very least be imagined as part of these texts' contingency, a component of their time-bound materiality, that these literary texts are also material, they are also time-bound, and history should be understood as a component of their materiality, an element of their unpredictability, that literary texts, historical texts as such are unpredictable, and history is only one component of their unpredictability, of their materiality. Approached sideways through the eccentric anecdote, history would cease to be a way of stabilizing texts. It would instead become part of their enigmatic beings. So texts, as Greenblatt admits here, are enigmatic, and history would become a part of the text's enigmatic being. It would stop being a stabilizing agent, a narrative that makes everything appear stable and unconflictual. This history, the new history, which we'll soon discover that it's counterhistory, this history would not be a way of stabilizing text. It would be a way to add up to the text's enigmatic being. Now, these anecdotes that Greenblatt describes are different from the ones described by Fineman and Barthes, because the anecdotes that Greenblatt needs and finds interesting were to puncture on purpose. They would go ahead and find anecdotes that do not fit in, that are sure to puncture the grand narratives. They rely as much on their offbeat content. Their content, number one, is going to be offbeat. This answers the second question that I raised in the beginning of this lecture, that what kind of anecdotes do they need? They need anecdotes that have offbeat content and whose form is incisive. The anecdotes that just puncture, that just perforate, that just are so incisive that they go right in. Moreover, they were designed not merely to disrupt and tantalize with flashes of an always accessible real. So they don't want anecdotes that just threaten to show something real, and because new historicists know that the real is always inaccessible. Anecdotes consciously motivated by an attempt to pry the usual sequences apart from their referents, to use Barthes' terms, might also point toward phenomena that were lying outside the contemporary borders of the discipline of history, and yet were not altogether beyond the possibility of knowledge per se. So, as Roland Barthes first said, that modern history considers the referent and the signified to be one, and that's where the fault lies. New historicists, through anecdotes, try to tear apart the signified from its referent. And it also points towards the phenomena that were lying outside the contemporary borders of the discipline of history, and yet were not altogether beyond the possibility of knowledge per se. So, through these anecdotes, the new historicists could find new knowledge, which was knowledge, all right, but it was considered beyond the discipline, not beyond, outside the discipline of history. It was considered too low to be discussed in historical narratives. For example, gender relations. Gender relations were considered as a part of culture. It wasn't considered a part of history. So in historical narratives, gender relations were hardly ever discussed. This was outside the discipline of history, but still knowledge per se. New historicists deliberately departed from the literary historical practice of creating embrasures for holding texts together inside of established accounts of change and continuity. So, what happened when literary histories are created? How do we study literary history? We create sections of the age of Queen Victoria, age of Queen Elizabeth, age of Romanticists, age of the Victorians. So, we create neat embrasures in which we can hold text inside of established accounts of change and continuity. In these accounts, there's change from era to era, but there's also continuity. But new historicists did not want that. What did they want to do? They used anecdotes instead to chip away at the familiar edifices and make plastered over cracks appear. They would not use anecdotes to create a narrative of change and continuity like the historical narratives do. What they want to do? They want to use the anecdote to chip away. Imagine the anecdote as a tool through which they are chipping away at a wall. And when they took away a part of the wall, they found some cracks. However, because we also hope to learn something about the past, the cracks themselves were taken to be recovered matter. Now, I'll take gender relations in my anecdote as the cracks that appeared when we read the anecdote against the grain. I did not read the anecdote in the way the historian meant it to be read. I read it from my own approach. So I used the anecdote to chip away at the historical text and I found cracks. But the cracks was also history. The crack was also knowledge. It was also recovered matter, something that I have recovered. Or adjusting our metaphor slightly, the anecdote could be conceived as a tool with which to rub literary texts against the grain. I read the anecdote that I gave example of against the grain of received notions about their determinants, revealing the fingerprints of the accidental, suppressed, defeated, uncanny, abjected, or exotic. In short, non-surviving, even if only fleetingly. So when you use anecdote in this manner, when you use anecdote to read historical texts against the grains, what do you find? You find accidental elements, suppressed elements, elements that are defeated, uncanny, abjected, or exotic. Something comes to my mind here. When you read Jane Eyre, and then if you read Jane Eyre from a post-colonial perspective, then Bertha Mason appears to be all of this, the accidental, the suppressed, the defeated, uncanny, abjected, or exotic. But if you don't look at Jane Eyre from a post-colonial perspective or a feminist perspective, to say the least, the story looks quite interesting. So Bertha Mason is an anecdote which was not completely digested and had repercussions. It was an undisciplined anecdote which readers like me read against the grain, read through my own approach. So I discovered something that was knowledge but outside the discipline of literary history. And what did I find? What did I find? I found the accidental, suppressed, defeated, uncanny, abjected, or exotic. In short, the non-surviving, even if only fleetingly. So new historicist anecdotes might, as Fineman's analysis proclaims, provoke new explanations, but these were not taken to be exclusive, uniform, or inevitable. Even the new historicist anecdotes provoke new explanations, as Fineman said in the beginning of this essay. Anecdotes will provoke new explanations, but these explanations were not taken to be uniform. They were not taken to be exclusive, that they are absolutist. They were not considered as inevitable explanations. So what is the quality of the knowledge that these new historicist critics claim to have recovered in the form of the cracks that were plastered over by grand narratives, but they rub anecdotes against the grain and they recovered the cracks. Under the cracks, they recovered the accidental, suppressed, defeated, uncanny, abjected, or exotic. But these explanations that these anecdotes provoked, the new explanations that the study of the anecdotes provoked, was not understood by the new historicists to be exclusive, uniform, or inevitable. This means that the knowledge that they've recovered, they are not claiming that this knowledge is exclusive, stable, or something that had to be recovered, that it was inevitable that these knowledges be recovered. The histories one wanted to pursue through the anecdote might therefore be called counter histories. Why would these histories be called counter histories? Because whatever they recovered was not exclusive. It was just another history, counter history, something that was going opposite to the grand history. So therefore it was just another history, and therefore it is called counter history. Whatever gets exclusive, whatever claims to be uniform, whatever claims to be inevitable, that becomes the grand history, that becomes the grand narrative, the dominant discourse. These explanations that the new historicist anecdotes claim to have found were not taken to be exclusive, uniform, or inevitable, and therefore these histories were called counter histories. And it would be all the more exhilarating to launch if their destinations were as yet undetermined and their trajectories lay athwart the best traveled routes. They already knew what's going to happen to the counter histories when there is a number of discourses going on, and one of them is the grand narrative, the others are counter histories. What's going to happen to the counter histories? The Greenblatt explains in the next paragraph, and we'll see what happens to that. We'll be using the term counter history to name a spectrum of assaults on the grand receipts inherited from the last century. So what is counter history? Counter history is a spectrum of assaults on grand history. Grand history and counter histories are existing side by side, but the counter histories are continuously attacking grand narratives of the time received from the previous generations. We take the term from Amos Funkenstein, who finds its earliest instances in rabbinical polemics against the Gospels, but who also applies it to the early stages of secular history as well. Now, I strongly suggest you guys to Google Amos Funkenstein and know something about his work, know why he's so important in this context. But I'm trying to give you a very brief one-sentence introduction to him. He was a Jewish scholar who studied how the Jewish religious texts created a counter history against the grand narrative of Christianity, against the Gospels, but who later on also applies the same methodology of studying history, of creating a counter history to secular history as well. So he's the one to have discovered this methodology and to give it a name. So this is what counter history is: to study two opposing strands and see how each tries to change the image of the other in their own head. Counter history opposes itself not only to dominant narratives but also to prevailing modes of historical thought and methods of research. So, counter history is not only counter to the dominant history, the dominant narratives, but also to the thought that's going on at that point of time, which is received from the previous generations. And it also counters the ongoing methods of research. Don't you see, this is the same thing that new historicist criticism is doing. It's countering the prevalent methods of research, the prevalent historical thought. Hence, when successful, it ceases to be counter. When a certain kind of discourse is trying to attack the dominant narrative, but it's also attacking the historical thought of that period, and it's also attacking the methods of research of that period. So, if this counter history becomes successful, it ceases to be counter, since it has taken over the methods of research, the historical thought, the dominant narrative has been taken over. Therefore, this counter history becomes the grand narrative. It ceases to be the counter history anymore. The grand receipts of the 19th century themselves began as counter-histories, and Funkenstein claims that history as a discipline has its roots in rebellion against the convenient, self-justifying official stories of priests and rulers. So, every history that became grand narrative later on was first initiated as a counter history only. It's only when it took over the current historical thought, the current methods of research, that it became a grand narrative, dominant discourse. So he gives you an example here that the grand receipts of 19th century also began as counter histories. It's only when they took over and they were successful that they became grand narratives later on. Counterhistory and history, in this view, are moments in a continuous conflictual process rather than substantial opposing activities with independently distinguishing characteristics. So it is clear by now that it's not that counterhistory and history exist in separate periods of time. They have separate features. They go into some directions that are clearly defined. Counterhistory and history are only moments in a continuous process, in a conflictual but continuous process, and they do not have any distinguishing characteristics as such. Nevertheless, there are times when even among professional historians, the impulse to discredit the old narratives and methods seems stronger than the impulse to synthesize new ones, and the 60s and 70s were one such time. In this line, Greenblatt says that the 60s and 70s were a time when even mainstream historians wanted to challenge the grand narratives. They were not here looking to create another grand narrative and record history in the traditional sense. Even they were trying to question the traditional idea of a monolithic history or the categorization of history separately from literature and culture. So why were the 60s and 70s this kind of time? The 60s and 70s in America was a turbulent time, a troubled time when there were huge protests over the Vietnam War. The site of these protests were mainly the university campuses all over the country, and the protesters were the members of mainly young generation. They took this opportunity, the protest, as an opportunity to question every value that was historically passed on to them, and there was an impulse to here again to discredit whatever they received, to discredit the old narratives. So this impulse was also passed on to the literary and historical fields of study and academia. So therefore, even professional historians were trying to discredit the old narratives in the 60s and 70s. Now in the following paragraph, this long paragraph on the whole page, Greenblatt describes 5 categories of writers, 5 categories of theories and philosophies that fell roughly or clearly into the counter-historical field. So there are clear 5 categories. You can see them on your screen. Number 1, the various, I'm going to read the paragraph and then go on describing the 5 categories to you. So the various facets of the counter-historical project in those decades were too self-conscious and determined, too programmatically opposed to the established orthodoxies to be easily assimilated into the process of history as usual. So Greenblatt again asserts that the counter-historical projects that he is going to mention after this line, these projects in those decades were very alert, they were self-conscious, and they were determined, they were sure, they were too programmatically opposed. They had a plan, a strong plan in place to oppose the established orthodoxies, the establishment histories, to be easily assimilated into the process of history as usual. They were too strong to be easily assimilated. They were too strong to be included in the processes of history. They had decided that they are going to stand out and that they are going to oppose and that they are going to challenge and question the history that they have received. The counter-historical spirit was, moreover, very widespread, inspiring, number 1, post-structuralists with a Nietzschean contempt for history's normal epistemological assumptions. That's the first category. What's the first category? The post-structuralists. So we know that in literary philosophical world, it was a period of post-structuralism, and we know that post-structuralism also stood for the same things. They stood for challenging the structures. They stood for challenging a method of critical analysis through the study of structures. They challenged the received notions of a monolithic history, and they challenged all literary, social, and political structures. So, the first category that Greenblatt mentions is the post-structuralists who had a Nietzschean contempt, like the philosopher Nietzsche. They had a contempt for history's normality. When history appeared normal, they knew that there are epistemological assumptions in it, and therefore they had a contempt, they had a dislike for history's normal epistemological assumptions, like Nietzsche had. Now, the second category that Greenblatt discusses is the next category, but also touching many whose faith in the possibility of historical knowledge remained quite undisturbed, even as they took up a rhetorical stance in opposition to history's dominant narrative discourse. Now, the next category includes people who basically studied historical structures only. They stuck to the study of history only, and yet rhetorically on the surface they maintained that they are creating a break with history, the normal history, and they took up a rhetorical stance in opposition to history's dominant narrative discourse. The stance that they took, Greenblatt assumes, was a rhetorical stance. They were still studying history to bring out new counter histories. So this was the second category. And who are these people in the second category? For example, the practitioners of anti-narrative, structural, Annales-style history. This was a school of history, a movement of history in France, where its founders and members, although adding the analysis of economy and social circumstances into historical methodology, but they still relied on the study of long-term histories. They called it longue durée, of long-term histories to make epistemological break and create a touch of objectivity in their historiography. But it also included people, historians, who emphasized the study of daily life following the lead of Norbert Elias and Michel de Certeau. So these two names that we find so strange here and don't know anything about, these two names I suggest you should definitely Google to know what they did. But I'll tell you in a very short way that these are the people who also relied on the study of history, but their subject was the study of daily life. So Elias's theory focused on the relationship between power, behavior, emotion, and knowledge. How power, behavior, emotion, knowledge, they're all interrelated subjects. And he only gained popularity in the same period in the 1970s. But Elias relied to study all these aspects of society through history, through studying daily life history. And Certeau's work combined history and psychoanalysis. He combined philosophy and social sciences, and he was also known as the philosopher of daily life, everyday life, and he was widely regarded as a historian of the old medieval period to the present urban life that he was living in. So he was regarded as a historian of all times. So these two historians that Greenblatt mentions are the historians he thinks maintained a rhetorical stance against dominant narrative, and yet their work was grounded at a very structural level, at a level which was still grounded in dominant discourse of history. So I'm going to repeat the two categories we've already covered in this paragraph. I told you there are 5, but we've covered 2 by now. And the first one is the post-structuralist with a Nietzschean contempt for history's dominant discourse. The people who straightforward dismissed history's grand narrative like Nietzsche did. And the second were people, historians, who on the surface rhetorically maintained that they are creating a break with history, they are discrediting the old narratives, and yes, they did bring in some new methods to historical analysis, but yet they were grounded in very structural methods of analyzing history, and this is the second category that Greenblatt talks about. Now moving on to the third category, I'll read it from the paragraph. Less resolutely structuralist was the host of feminist anti-racist, working class, and other radically revisionist historians, practitioners of history from below, who professed to counter the history of the victors with that of the vanquished. Now, this is the kind of prose that Greenblatt was famous for. His prose was understood to be crisp and to the point and interesting. So, here's a glimpse of it. The third category that he talks about, he says it's less resolutely structuralist. These people that we are going to just study about, these people were less structuralist. They were completely post-structuralists in that manner. And who are these people? These are feminist historians, anti-racist theorists, working class writers, and other radically revisionist historians. Historians who want to revise history in a radical way. They are not rhetorically maintaining that they are discrediting the old narratives. They really want to revise history radically. And these are the people, the categories that I mentioned: feminist, anti-racist, working class, and revisionist historians. These are the practitioners of history from below, who profess to counter the history of the victors with that of the vanquished. What type of counter history they are trying to create? Against the grand narrative, against the history of the victors, the people who emerged winners. They are going to create a counter history of the people who were defeated, who were betrayed, who were vanquished. This was the third category. Now we've done three categories. The first were the post-structuralists with the Nietzschean contempt of grand narratives. The second are the people who maintained they are breaking away with the old narratives, but they were still grounded in structural methods of studying history. And the third, who were more radical, more post-structuralists than them, who are feminist, anti-racist, working class, and radically revisionist historians. Now the fourth category is the category of the people who created counterfactuals. Now, what is counterfactuals? A counterfactual is a hypothesis, a claim that if this happened, what would be the impact of that? For example, I read about a book some days ago that a person has written that what if Donald Trump did not win the 2016 election? How would events go then? So, this is a counterfactual, imagining that things were different from how they actually happened, contrary to the facts. And this is used to assess the impact of an action and imagine the impact of an action. So the fourth category was the category of counterfactuals who imagined alternate histories. And the last category, the fifth category, is of the people who created fictional alternate histories, like Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. So this is the fifth categories. So now we have all five categories. Number one, post-structuralists. Number two, people who still were grounded in structural analysis. Number three, radical revisionist historians. Number four, counterfactuals. And number five, people who took popular genres and created fictional alternate histories like Philip K. Dick and his work, The Man in the High Castle. So the five categories that Greenblatt just mentioned is a presentation of how counter history is not a single, unilinear, unidirectional project. How various voices, various opinions that counter history represents come from different corners of society, from different types of historians, and how it's not just a narrative history. Also, there is an unexpectedness of its sources. We were not expecting working class to create their own history. We were not expecting women to create their own history. We were not expecting people who are colonized to create their own history. The source of these counter-historical projects is so uneven and unexpected that the new historicist critics like Stephen Greenblatt were confident that they were going in the right direction, because this direction was opposite to the grand narratives. So I'm going to read the paragraph now. Along this counter-historical continuum, From post-structuralist negativity, see the trajectory that he's mentioning once again that he discussed in the previous paragraph, he mentions it again. Number one, the post-structuralist negativity through the recovery of the longue durée. This is the second category, the recovery of histories that were long duration. And third, the history of the losers. This includes the feminist, anti-racist, working class and radically revisionist historians. The envisioning of counterfactuals, that's the fourth category, and provisional historical worlds are the fictional alternate history that he mentions with Philip K. Dick's work. So these are the 5 categories that maps out, that traces the trajectory that counter-historical projects have taken. So with these categories, he says, our sense of delayed and alternative chronologies, that we are not in a hurry to create embrasures, to create walls to hold in similar sounding narratives. No, they were ready for a delayed chronology. They were ready for an alternative chronology. They sensed a resistance to change in these 5 movements. They sensed a resistance to change. The unevenness and the unexpectedness of its sources. See, we were not expecting, as I said, some classes to write their own histories. So the unexpectedness of its sources, all these factors made the new historicists more confident, that they are more assured that they are going in the mapped direction, in the right direction. Now, he says, the reality of unrealized possibilities became fuller and more engrossing. Now here they had a hope that unrealized possibilities are real and counter-histories are mapping them out. So while deterministic and unilinear explanations became correspondingly unappealing and unsatisfying, narratives that were going in a particular direction appeared non-conflictual, appeared stable. Narratives like that became unappealing and unsatisfying, and that creates the appeal of new historicism as a method of critical analysis. Now Greenblatt continues, the new historicist anecdote was a conduit for carrying these counter-historical insights and ambitions into the field of literary history. So the anecdote is credited for bringing all these sometimes opposing, sometimes sounding different, all these 5 categories that we talked about. These are the sorts of impulses that the anecdote was becoming an instrument of carrying into the literary world. Through the anecdote, through the small stories, the small accounts of events and people, the anecdote was bringing all these above impulses into the field of literary history. It might indeed be said to have carried too many of them in ill-assorted bunches, for the anecdotes often seem to combine desires for maintaining enigmas and for recovering lost worlds, for anachronizing events and for historicizing texts. Simply read, this line means that the 5 categories we saw in the paragraph above were the kind of impulses that the anecdote brought into the field of literature. It means that through anecdotes we came to know that these are the different impulses that the anecdote brought, but it also brought too many of these impulses. For example, I can give you so many instances where anecdotes revealed histories that were suppressed. You've read Om Prakash Valmiki's anecdotes, right? They were so heart-touching. So he relied upon anecdotes to show his plight as a Dalit. I can give you many more examples like the post-9/11 Muslim memoirs in the US, diaspora writing, homosexual histories, human-animal narratives where animals are exploited, disability stories, domestic violence, trauma narratives. So see, these are the impulses that the anecdotes were bringing to literary history, literary criticism. Without the anecdote, if one only relied on high literature, on canonical works, so these minor impulses which were of such importance to counter histories, they would have been suppressed. So it might indeed be said to have carried too many of them. There are too many of them now, and they are ill-assorted ill-assorted bunches. All these directions, all these subjects that I just talked about, they are not going into one, apart from exploitation. I don't think there's a common strand between them. So they are ill-assorted bunches, and they have a paradoxical purpose. Number one, they want to maintain enigmas because they are coming into the literary world, and one part of it believes in maintaining enigmas about stories. But it also wants to recover lost worlds. Through these stories, we recover worlds that are lost, that are suppressed. So this is a paradoxical desire for anachronizing events, to shift the timing of the events, to displace the event from its time period, but for also historicizing texts, but to also to place texts in history and make texts historical. So this is also a paradoxical desire which the anecdote attempts to attain. The anecdotal impulse in New Historicism, that is, drew from different and not always strictly reconcilable parts of the counter-historical spectrum. I'll give you an example and it will make it clearer for you to understand this line. So Greenblatt says that anecdotal impulse, that all these categories, for example, I just talked about, like Dalit writing, post 9/11 writing, diaspora writing. I'll give you an example. While I was reading about human animal narratives, and I saw some texts that compared the exploitation of women with the exploitation of animals. I also read that there are some objections that women raise by being compared with animals. So see, the feminist and the animal histories here do not really reconcile with each other. The women have problems being compared with animals in this instance. Otherwise, there are some women who have written books when they compare themselves to animal and they tell that the exploitation is almost the same. So, but in the previous case where women raise objections on being compared with animals, the impulses are not strictly reconcilable, and that is what this line says. And yet, the feminist history, animal history, other kinds of writings that do not reconcile with each other still form an aspect of the counter-historical spectrum. Animal history is a counter-history. Feminist history is a counter-history. They still form the wide spectrum of counter-histories. But these very inconsistencies may account for some of the anecdotes' appeal. Instead of making choices, they combine theoretically paradoxical elements. It allowed one to have one's Nietzschean skepticism along with the desire to make contact with the real, or driving one to divulge the suppressed, unofficial, authentic story, as well as to imagine what might have but did not actually happen. So once again, through the 5 categories that Greenblatt mentioned, he says that the anecdote appealed to the new historicists because the anecdote carried all these paradoxical elements, all these different sounding histories into the purview of literary history, and therefore the anecdote seemed so appealing to new historicists. Instead of making clear-cut choices, is whether it's structuralist, whether it's post-structuralist, whether it's something else, instead of making clear-cut choices, anecdotes offered a combination of theoretically paradoxical elements that seem theoretically opposed, theoretically paradoxical, and yet they were so vehemently present in all those anecdotes that he talks about. Letting one have Nietzschean skepticism, one could carry on with his Nietzschean skepticism, doubt everything, and yet have a desire to come into contact with the real stories through an anecdote. It also drives one to divulge the suppressed, unofficial, authentic story. One could, through these anecdotes, reveal something that has been suppressed, an authentic, unofficial story that has been suppressed. One had the option of revealing that story through the power of an anecdote. These are the various ways in which the anecdote proved itself to be of great value for the new historicist literary critic. New historicism's counter-historical affiliations are thus a tangle of crossing lines, and in this chapter we can sort out only two: British radical history and French Foucauldianism. Now, Greenblatt says that we have clearly seen that the impulse that anecdotes carry into literary history, the impulse that new historicism strives to recover, and counter historical projects promise, these impulses are a tangle of crossing lines. They are not unilinear. You could see that these are a tangle of crossing lines. And in the chapter, in the coming sections, there are two of these lines that Greenblatt is going to discuss. One is British radical history, mainly about Raymond Williams, and second is French Foucauldianism, mainly about the French theorist Michel Foucault. At the time, these seemed the most historically ambitious and energetically rebellious, and in hindsight, we can see that they were also given to anecdotes. Now, Greenblatt is going to illustrate how the British radical history and French Foucauldianism was rebellious, was anti-grand narrative, was historically ambitious, was trying to do something new. And in hindsight, now that we see, we'll take a look at them, we know that they also took help from anecdotes. They also used anecdotes to create a counter-history of their own. Although all of the writers we're about to discuss were influential, Raymond Williams, Foucault and other writers that they're going to discuss, they're all influential, but they are not models. Instead, they formed an environment, a large, unmapped and inviting disciplinary borderland. They created a new borderland, a new area where all the disciplines could be discussed openly. They are not models, but they created an environment, a large territory in which all these impulses could be welcomed with an open heart. So this was it about the first part of this essay. I hope it was clear to you. If there are still some doubts and questions, you can write in the comment box and I'll definitely try to get back to you and answer your queries. Also, please look out for the second part of this essay in which I discuss British radical history. So don't miss out on that. Also, finally, I would like to summarize the main points that we've discussed in this part of this essay. The 5 main points that we've covered here are: number 1, anecdotes puncture grand narratives. Number 2, anecdotes help in tearing apart the events from their narratives, the reference from the signified. Number 3, new historicists looked for and picked those anecdotes which were weird and outlandish and helped them in recovering small suppressed stories. Number 4, anecdote is a perfect tool to study the emergence of counter-histories in literature. Number 5, anecdotes carried varied impulses, irreconcilable impulses into the field of literary history. These are the 5 main points that we covered in this part of this essay. I hope it's clear. Thanks a lot for your time and patience. And if this video helped you, please do not forget to share it with your friends. Thanks a lot.